George Wacker. With me is Bill McGinnis and Fred Burton. Bill McGinnis is a longtime resident of Siskiyou County and a historian in his own right. I say a historian in his own right because Bill McGinnis was the ringleader and one of the hard workers for the State of Jefferson 1941 rebellion. And Fred Burton here is a old-timer here. He's born and raised here at the Forest House and has lived his entire life here, the present owner of the property. As you know, we are sitting here in front of the Forest House Ranch, which is one time was a stage stop for stages traveling from Scott Valley to Yreka.
I know this old Forest House here, George, if the walls in this place could talk, we'd sure have a lot of history to give to a thing. But, you know, you speak of me of being a long-time resident here. I'm just a newcomer. I've only been here 52 years.
52 years, yeah.
Now, you take Fred over there, you want to talk to somebody about this stuff. There's the boy that knows.
Well, as you say, these old walls could talk, Bill. They could tell many an interesting tale, but of course the walls can't talk. But Fred Burton can talk, though.
I can talk a little bit.
Well, I know you can, Fred, and you're the one that can tell about there because you was born here, you've seen the history that has transpired here, and have heard the stories of the past, and we'd like to know some history of the Forest House Ranch House here. I understand that was quite a place that served Yreka here in the early days in many different ways.
That's true, George. The old house is about 133 years old. It was originally started in 1851. It was lived in 1852, and it was completed in 1854. The main pusher of the whole project was a man by the name of Marshall Short. He had various other partners. He had a man by the name of Horace Knight, and they had one of the first sawmills in Siskiyou County here. It was an overshot sawmill, and with that they built the old house and the buildings around it.
Excuse me, Fred, what is an overshot sawmill?
Well, we still have the buckets over there by the ice house, and the water came out of the creek, and they surged it out of the creek down a ditch, and then they would put it up at the top of the wheel, the bucket line, and the bucket would fill with water and turn, and in turn that would make the boards. And they were very, very good at it. The millwright must have been a real fine millwright. He could make fine boards, all true. He made boards for apple boxes, and all the old house here, the materials are mostly from the range. They had a lime kiln for the mortar, for the bricks and the plaster, and that was over this mountain. I'm looking right toward it. Had several lime kilns there. There's a family by the name of Stockslager, who were related to the Marlows, and Albert Marlow is still here in Yreka. That would be a grandson, I believe. They ran the lime deposits. Down here about, I would say a mile and a half, they had a brick kiln, and they made all the brick. They baked the brick for the chimneys. And of course the lumber came from the forests around here, and I understand that the forests were quite impressive in those days.
Excuse me, Fred, in 1854, the town of Yreka just practically burned down the business district there. They had old shacks of shakes and canvas, and understand that this mill here at this site here supplied the lumber for the rebuilding of the town at that time. Is that?
No, the old gentlemen that owned this place then, they refused to sell their lumber. They wanted to continue building here.
Oh.
A contractor came out from Yreka after the big fire of 1854 and offered them $16,000, which was quite a lot of money in those days. But they refused, but I have a clipping on that from the newspaper. And well, anyway, the house was built and finished, and it was for more or less the traveling public. It was quite a social place at one time. We have a dance hall upstairs. It's a dance hall of about 30 feet by 60, and it has a spring floor. And that floor springs because they put a 4x4 over on the far side and took long stringers without any other supports in them, and so it's supported, the dance floor is supported on 30 feet 4x4s set 30 feet apart. And you can go up there now and spring up and down and see how they did the schottisches and the quadrilles and got a little more oomph to it. And downstairs, right back of me here, was the bar room. This was a stop for the thirsty teamsters, and they could get their drinks in here. Some of the liquor was purchased elsewhere, but as time went on, they had this very large orchard, and they had 2 licensed distilleries here. I have copies of the brandy gaugers, the U.S. brandy gaugers. They made some pretty potent stuff. They made liquor that would go as much as 110 proof. They'd have Applejack primarily, and peach brandy, and then they had wines and a number of different currant wine, I remember. George, you were saying something?
I remember when I was a child, I used to refer to the old famous Forest House Applejacks.
Oh, yeah.
It had quite a name for itself.
That's true. They said that they could, the teamsters with good noses could smell the mash when they got to the top of the mountain. So, that's about 3.5, 4 miles away. Those old copper stills were much like those stills that are at Sutter's Fort, if people remember those stills that they might have seen at Sutter's Fort. And when my father came here in 1990, he sold the stills for the copper. He should have kept it for the Prohibition area, and I think we'd be lots richer. This became the largest orchard in California. In the early 60s, they had 10,000 bearing apple trees, and then peaches and plums and prunes and nectarines. They even had a few almonds. The almonds didn't do too well. They had walnuts. They had a vineyard over right straight back of where I'm looking now, right in that direction. They had a crabapple orchard over there. And they had the gardens in below here. And they had good gardens. And
see the apple trees in there now.
Well, that you're looking at is really a nursery. Old Marshall Short really knew his trees. He knew his apples. And that was a nursery, and he would graft his own. That was mostly grafting stock that just carried on. And down in the fields here below, the orchards would go down there, a mile and more through these fields. And I have pictures of them. Maybe you can dub them in. But
with that many apple trees, 10,000, that's a tremendous orchard. They must have shipped apples in away from here.
Oh yes, we had a friend that was on a train in New York, and he said that he bought Forest House apples on a train in New York. And they were shipped up and down the state of California and even into Oregon. Most of the nursery stock came from Oregon originally. Mr. Short brought it in here, and then he started his own nursery. We had, of course, the cider presses and the cider mills. We even had a cider mill that I'd say we did, the people before us did, a cider mill that was run by a horse. And I think they called the horse Snyder, and they said that Snyder made the apple cider, and he went round and round and pressed the mash. When I was born, I can remember hundreds of barrels over there, and those barrels were branded, those big barrels were branded with K and Company, and that was for Knight and Company, one of the partners. The old ice pond over there was used up until 1932. My family cut ice there in 1932, and I have a picture of that. We had ice at different years that would last a long, long time, as much as 2 years. The ice was cut with saws and made into blocks, and the pond is in the shade of the mountain so that it wouldn't thaw in the winter. And we'd get ice out of there about 6 inches thick, sometimes more, depending on the weather. The old-timers knew how to make ice. That little air pocket in the mud puddle doesn't make ice, so they would cut their ditches under the ice and fill that air pocket, and that would make thicker ice. And if it was a warmer year, they would flood it both top and bottom. The top part would be somewhat aerated, but it would nevertheless good ice. And we'd skid it over to, on the ice, over to a chute that went down into the ice house, and we'd drop it down in there to sawdust, and then the man with tongs would pile it. And I think the last time we put ice in there, it was probably piled in a pile about 20 feet by 20 feet by 6 feet high. Then my father would go down to the creek with cream cans and milk buckets and whatnot and load up some water and take it out there and pass it in to the men inside, and they would throw that water over the ice, and that would make it more or less a solid block and it'll last longer. Then when you wanted the ice in the summertime, you just took about 4 inches of sawdust off and looked down there and you'd find a little line where the saws had been, and you'd take a crowbar and break those chunks loose. Let's see what else I can tell you about them.
There must have been, with that grand ballroom upstairs, there must have been quite a few social functions here.
Oh yes, this was the place to come to, you know, marriage parties and sleighing parties and whatnot. They'd hire sleighs and buggies and whatnot and come out here for their parties. And they had a number of dances here. I have some records of some of those, even a program or two of some of the old dances, and one in 1882 I remember. And we had the ladies' parlor there. The room that was used for the ladies' parlor is to the left there. It's the one, well, it's to my left. It would be to your right as you're looking at it. And that room was used for the ladies. The ladies ordinarily didn't go in the bar room. And so the men would go in there, and they'd have a card table or two in there, and they'd have their drinks and whatnot. And then on the party nights, somehow they cleared the ballroom out of the beds that were always there. The traveling public would sleep in beds around the ballroom. And there are still 10 or 12 beds up there around that old ballroom. But I suppose they took those beds on dance nights and put them over in a bunkhouse that was over here just to my left, to your right. And then they'd have their dances, and they would bring their girlfriends out on this porch that you see and hold hands there and watch the buggies come in and go, and maybe they'd give the girls a little drink. But for the most part, it was men traveling then, and ladies weren't much on the road. They weren't the traveling public. It was mostly for men.
Fred, I remember your father and mother real well, and they were grand people, and they're real pioneers. And when did they come to the Forest House Ranch here?
Well, as I said, Mr. Short built the place, Marshall Short, and Mr. Knight was his close partner, and the sawyer was a man by the name of Sanborn, and then there was a man by the name of Wadley and a man by the name of Grisey that put money into the thing. But the man that really did it was Marshall Short, and he came here in 1851, and he died in front of the fireplace there in 1909. And my father bought it that fall. My mother and father had come back from Alaska. They'd been up there for a 2-year honeymoon to Nome mining gold. They came back here and they had enough money to put a down payment on this place, and they did that. And so Marshall Short had it, and he kept on there, and the rest of them dropped out more or less. And he kept on until 1909. He had a nephew, a man by the name of R.M. Brown, that came out of Texas, and the Browns lived here off and on from 1895 until the old uncle died, and then the Browns sold it to my folks. And so Marshall Short lived here 58 years. My father lived here 59 years, and it's been in the family since then, you know, the last 16 years. We've had it these 16 years.
And the old stages come right down through here, hitched up at this here.
This is the old stage road, yes.
Yeah, and then did they come from Scott Valley, and did they stop here overnight before proceeding into Yreka, a lot of them?
Oh, sometimes. Sometimes they changed horses here. There was a toll road here in the 1860s. We have copies of the old papers from the toll road, at least 2 of them. And the toll gate was right here, right just at the end of this hitching post. And then the other toll gate was up at Robbers Rock, which is on top of Fort Jones Mountain. And it was manned by an old gentleman by the name of Yank Johnson. He was called Yank because those were the days of the Civil War, and he was very much in favor of the North. But they made this a free road, shortly after 1864. And the folks here contributed heavily to it. And after that, the stages came here more. They were going through Greenhorn, which was a free road, and they had the mining over there in McAdams Creek and in Indian Creek and whatnot, and so the stages stopped here more often. The teamsters came over a lot, and we'd have maybe 50 horses here, our own horses, and teams that would be just kept here. Sometimes they'd stay overnight, sometimes they wouldn't. This was quite a cattle stop and livestock stop after the trains came through Montague. And just hundreds and hundreds of head of cattle would stop here overnight, and then they'd continue on and be driven to the railhead at Grenada or Montague. They had pig drives to here, and of course sheep drives, and then the pack trains in early days came through here, the mule pack.
You know, just being here at this old historic site and listening to your old stories, why, it just reminds a person, Bill, just how fortunate we are to live in an area that has so much rich history and rich historic sites. So we're just blessed with a lot.
It's really a superb country, George.
And it's so close to town here. This is only 4 miles from town here, that on State Route 3. Right. And Fred, you made a mention here of Robbers Rock. That's right above here, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, there were robberies there. There were probably 6 robberies at the rock itself. I have confirmation and articles from old newspapers of 4, and I can tell you about those a little later on, I suppose.
Well, let's go up the rock.
We'll have to go up the rock.
All right. I'd like to tell you a little bit about how primitive it was here. In those days, they didn't have very many places for bathing, you know, and so they had a very proper bathhouse back behind the old house here, and they had one side for the ladies and one side for the men, and they had these galvanized bathtubs. And when you sat in the galvanized bathtub, you were very, very cold at the bottom, but up there where the hot water was, it was lots hotter. And I've bathed in those. We had one inside the old house. And then down there, of course, they had the chick sail. They had a very large chick sail. I think they had 4 seats on one side, and on the ladies' side they had 2, and then one for a child. And that was back down there. They also had the old ovens, those big ovens. There are ovens like that at Sutter's Fort again, and they had 2 down there. They've washed away and deteriorated. They had as many as 30 women cutting fruit over there, and they had an evaporator. It was artificial drying. They dried the fruit by wood heat. And we have the old oven there yet. I've had pictures of the old dry house, and it went up into a belfry and down on screens, the cut fruit. And the ladies also jarred fruit. We have many, many fruit jars here that have the mark of 1859 and so on, you know, and so that's about it for now, for here, I guess.
Well, I'd say let's take a run up that Robbers Rock there and view the site itself.
Let's see what happened up there. Yeah,
okay,
all right.
We'll just do that. Now, you got time, Fred?
I've got the time.
All right, fine.
It says on this site at least 4 known stagecoach robberies occurred. In the holdup of September 25th of 1897, the robber William Harrell was trailed to Delta in Shasta County, where he was killed in a gun battle, during which he killed Under Sheriff William A. Radford. That's the one Fred spoke about. The last holdup here and in California occurred on July 5th of 1908 and remains unsolved to this date. Well, now Fred and George and I have traveled all the way up to the top of the Fort Jones summit above Forest House at the point known as Robbers Rock. Fred's got quite a bit of information for us on that. We're standing alongside of the plaque here that was put in by E. Clampus Vitus that commemorates the at least 4 burglaries, but Fred says there are more than that. Is that true, Fred?
I think there might have been as many as 6. At least there was 6 on the mountain here that we know of, and there are 2 that I don't have the dates on with me. I've got the dates on 2 of them, but then I have the data on 2 others.
Well, that's quite a bunch of robberies here at this point. It seems like it was a kind of a spot that was ideal for their purposes, I guess. The size of the rock and the hiding position that they could be in to surprise the driver.
Well, the rock was originally somewhat larger, maybe twice as large as it is now, and it was blown off. The top of this rock was blown off and put around up here to support the turn. The old stage road came up the canyon here and made the turn here and then up over the top of the mountain. Of course, there were many stage robberies, well, not many, but several stage robberies on this mountain before 1897. But there was one in 1897 that more or less stands out. It was a robbery that was here, and they traced the man down to Kennett down in Shasta County. And in a few days they confronted him down there, and there was a deputy named Radford. Deputy sheriff came down from Yreka down there, and so the other deputy that was helping him went to the back of this man's house, and Radford went to the front and he rapped on the door. The lady came to the door, the wife, and asked if Radford was there, and she said yes. And so Radford showed up out of another room and came to the front door, and he said, "I've been waiting for you." He shook hands with him, and he said, "I've been waiting for you," and he pulled him across the threshold and shot him. And so then the other deputy, he got into it, and he was shot in the leg, but before he was disabled too much, he killed the robber.
No.
And that was an 1897 robbery. Now there was another robbery here in the 1890s, and one of our old citizens that's just recently deceased was on that stage. And that somewhere in the 1890s, Winnie Nelson from down the Klamath River was on the stage, and she was just an infant in arms, and she spoke Shasta Indian. She was a Shasta Indian, and her mother told her, first of all, the robber made the whip, the driver, put down the Wells Fargo box, and then he told all the people to line up, and he started taking their wallets and their watches and things and did that. But he made them line up and face the top of the mountain, which is straight ahead of me. And Winnie Nelson was held by her mother, but she looked over the shoulder of her mother, and her mother whispered to her in Shasta language and said, "See where they go." So Winnie did that, and they went down this hill behind me, and there are several trails that go down there, but Winnie was able to tell her mother and the peace officers which trail they took. And those robbers were also caught. Then there was another robbery here, and the exact date of that I don't have, but it was in the time when Scott Howard, as sheriff here, was sheriff, and the fellow held up the stage here, and then he took off through the mountains, and he would go off to my right here, and he got into the area of Humbug, and so he was known there, and they kind of got on his trail, and he went on across the Klamath River, and as he got on the other side of the Klamath River, he tore his mackinaw, his coat, and a piece came out of his coat, and the sheriff could try, in those days there weren't too many horse tracks through, and the sheriff could follow him on through, and he got up in the Applegate River and caught this man, and he matched the piece of coat, the mackinaw, with the coat the man wore, and it fitted, it matched. So the man was convicted. And then the stage robber, the stage driver, I mean, on that the robber was named Alex Conroy, and there was an Eli Kelly and an Indian in on that. And so the stage driver was a Lewis Perry. And when they caught this robber, they took his pistol away. And where's this pistol?
Right. This pistol here,
over
Fred.
there,
All right,
on the other side there.
They took this pistol away from the robber, and the sheriff took it back and gave it to the stage driver. And then the stage driver ultimately gave it to a friend of mine in Humbug, and we traded him out of it. So we have this pistol. That
actual gun was used in.
Yeah, this is an 1892 military pistol and a 6-shooter revolver, and that was actually the gun used here. On July the 5th of 1908, they had another robbery here. My mother missed it by 1 day. She was on the stage the next day. But that robbery was held here, and possibly a woman participated in that robbery. There were 2 people, the 2 robbers, and an old woodcutter and his wife disappeared shortly after that robbery. Those people were never caught. And the robber made the stage driver, who was a person that I knew and knew quite well. I'm sure George did. His name was Coog Vetterlein.
Coog Vetterlein.
Yeah, and Coog was around Yreka for quite a few years. Yeah, I think he died in the 40s there.
I knew him myself.
Oh, did you?
Oh, yes.
And anyway, Coog threw down the box, and the robber took the axe off the stage, and he started chopping it open right there on the ground. And he broke Coog's axe handle, and he apologized.
Nice fellow.
That box is in the in Fort Jones Museum. We had it here, another few months back, but I returned it to the Scott Valley Museum. It's there, and it's got the chopped hole in it. There was a man by the name of Dannenbrink on that, a man who was an attorney over in Etna, and he lost his gold watch. But finally he got that gold watch back, and I don't know how. Maybe somebody was just honest enough to give him back that gold watch. He took all the money, that robber did, all the money that the people had, and the stage driver, Coog, said he wanted some money for a drink when he got to Fort Jones, so the robber flipped him back 50 cents.
He was a pretty nice fella.
Yeah.
He's polite.
Yeah.
Well,
did he apologize about the money too? Or
I guess he did. There have been other attempts and robberies here on the other side of the mountain, people trying to get the money people were taking to pay their taxes with. And in one instance, it was my grandfather was tipped off that there was a robber up there by a certain tree, and so he whipped his horse up and got by there without being stopped by the robber, and got his tax money over. This ravine here, this saddle in this mountain, this opening here, has been the scene of quite a lot of transportation through here. Of course, I don't know how many, maybe millions of dollars worth of gold came through there.
No doubt, yeah.
They had the big dredges there. They had the big mines, the Morrison Carlock mine and the Sheba and all those. So many thousands of dollars in gold came through here, and at times it must have been quite lucrative. They had the sheep and the cattle that came through here would number in the thousands. I have an article on the old Hammond family. They came through here in, I think it was 1864, with 600 or 700 head of cattle, and they drove them all the way to Benicia and sold them down there. And then, you know, they'd stop along the way.
They'd have to go the Shasta route then, wouldn't they?
Yeah,
they couldn't go through the Sacramento Canyon in those days.
Well, I think they went way out into more or less toward the Alturas country.
Well, I didn't have to
got through the military pass
get
and
through there.
through there.
Oh, yeah, but you couldn't get through the Sacramento Canyon.
But it took them, I think, 2 weeks for just drive one way and maybe more. I don't remember all of that.
Tremendous thing.
But all of those old families in the valley would bring their cattle through here and stop at the forest house. And then after the railheads, they'd stop at the forest house and then go on. This is the other end of the Shasta-Scott Valley Turnpike, the toll road, and old Yank Johnson had his toll station just up there under a spring right ahead of us here, and he carved out some old pipes out of roots and sold them along. He had a bear trap up on the hill there, and I can remember that bear trap. And that bear trap was a log bear trap. And it was made of rather substantial logs, and it was set back into the hill and was a, well, rectangular trap. And the door was tied up. The heavy door was tied up to the top of the ceiling, and they had a pulley there. And from that pulley, they had a rope that went out to the end of the building that's on the mountain end there, and then down to a plug in the log. And it was a heavy plug because they didn't want it to pull out with that door and close the door. So they'd put on that plug, they'd put some bacon or some meat that they wanted the bear to investigate, and the bear would come in, and he would grab the meat and pull the plug, and the door was closed behind him. And they would go up there and they'd look in through the logs and see if that's a bear they wanted to keep or not. And they kept cubs, and they'd bring them down to the forest house there. We had bear down there. I've had bear down there. And the people before us, all the way along the line, back to 1850-something or so, had bear. But they principally caught those bear up here in this log bear trap. That log bear trap burned during Prohibition era when a still blew up or something over in Soap Creek, and they had 3 good fires there in the canyon, and that one fire came over the hill and burned up our bear trap. And,
what did they have, bear and bull fights down there?
Oh yes, I forgot to tell you when we were down at the forest house that they did have one bear and bull fight there. It was written up in the Chicago Tribune by Alex Roseborough, and Mr. Brown, the fellow that my father bought the ranch from, he told me about that. He told me where it was, and the men would sit around on the upright planks and make bets on who would win the fight. It was a vicious bear and a vicious bull, and they got them angered, and they started this fight. And
who did win?
Well, I guess neither one really won, because the bear was killed first, but he was so badly gored that he died, but right away. But the bull died a little bit later. He was all chewed up, and so it was a kind of a loss.
Kind of a no-win situation,
yeah.
I would think.
The bear we had were called Itchy and Scratchy, and we have some pictures of them. And the bear that the last bear that I heard of was by the Browns was a male bear called Susie, and it was called Susie because the little girl thought that'd be a nice name for that bear. And I remember that they told me that Susie sat down on Mr. Brown's lap and crushed one of the better chairs that Mrs. Brown thought a lot of. Anyway, there's a little bit of old range war here, and it involved my father.
The cattle and sheep? Or?
Well, yeah, cattle and sheep. My father was a cattleman. He never took care of the orchard much, and didn't go that way. He went to cattle. And there was this Patty Hogan. Patty Hogan was a sheep herder, and he came up here in the 20s, and somebody told my father that he was coming up the road there from the Yreka direction, and he had, many sheep, I don't know, 1,000 or more. And in those days we had board fences, and some of our boards there, and the alfalfa was up. Some of our boards went on, and so Dad went down to his dogs, and he had good dogs, and he protected his fields pretty good, and he got up there and he told this Patty Hogan, and Patty had one sheep herder with him. He said, all this rangeland from here at the top of the mountain where we are now is mine. And he said, you get these sheep off my rangeland tonight. And so somewhat later, just about dark or sundown, it was getting late, a man came down the mountain and said, Fred, those sheep are bedded down up there on your meadow, and there's a meadow in here behind me, just a little meadow. So my father got his old car, and he came up here, and there was this kind of a road, a pretty rocky road. And he went up the hill there, and Patty was up there by a campfire. So he grabbed Patty by the boot, and he dragged him down to the road, and they had a fight. And it was a vicious fight. Patty lifted my father's ear here about 1/4 of an inch, and he got his teeth around my father's thumb, and he chewed that pretty good. And finally, my father whipped him. They were fighting in the lights of this old car, and the sheepdogs and the cattle dogs got in a fight. We had 2 hired hands, and he had the one sheep herder, and they didn't fight. They were just holding the kids back, my brother and myself. Anyway, finally, my father whipped Patty, and he put his cattle dogs down under the sheep and drove them over the mountain. And that was the way to get Patty off here. He ran into Patty later on a train, a cattle train and sheep train going down through the Sacramento Valley, and they had to stay in the same caboose all night long. They keep their cattle up, you know, so they wouldn't be stomped on. And so they had coffee back there, and when the train would stop or sidetrack, they'd go back and look at their sheep and cattle. And Patty refused to recognize my father. And so my father said, "Oh, you're the man that drove those sheep up there in a certain year over into Fort Jones and pastured in that area." And he denied it. And finally, he got off the train, and as the cattle were going one way and the sheep the other, and he said, "Burton, if I never meet you again until I meet you in hell, I'll know you're there." So
he didn't apologize.
No, he didn't apologize. He was quite an Irishman. Anyway, that was about it for.
I see you have some bells back there.
Oh yes, that was another robbery. These are hame bells, and these bells go down the hames of the lead horses, and they were designated to let the other teams know that a wagon was approaching on these narrow roads, and they had to make room to pass. So this ingenious robber, and I think it was at this rock, he got these bells out and he rang the bells. And so the stage driver thought that a freight wagon was coming, and he stopped here, and then the stage robber came out from behind this rock and robbed the stage. And that was another one of the robberies that was here.
That was ingenious.
Yes, that was. There's another interesting thing that came through this pass, and that was in 1894. In 1894, they
1984 is getting different, isn't it?
All right. 1894, they had 4 murderers in the Yreka jail. And apparently the posse was formed in Scott Valley, and they came through this pass, and they lynched those 4 murderers on the lawn of the courthouse. And just down below us here, about a mile, there was an Indian Negro family. They were part Indian and part Negro, and the girls came back and visited at times, and they remember that night. And their mother kept them quiet in the house that was close to the road there. They could hear the riders coming across the plank bridge there. And then they heard them going back. And then down below the old forest house, about a mile, there was an old lady by the name of Mary Sell. She used to have a dairy there at Fort Jones, supply Fort Jones with milk there about the high school. Anyway, Mary Sell said that next day the road was littered with masks, and they were black silk masks. And as the men rode back to Scott Valley, they threw their masks away. But that lynching was in 1894, and the last lynching in California was down the road here, down there by the mill, the sawmill, the Pine Mountain Sawmill. And then the last stagecoach robbery in the West was at this rock.
The last train robbery was up on the Siskiyou.
Is that right?
Yeah, 1922,
yeah, Tunnel 13, you know. But
all right, that's about it. You want
a very interesting
This has been an interesting trip, Fred. My gosh, I tell you, I've learned. I've been here all my life, and I've heard a lot of things I've never heard before, even just and known you for all my life too.
It's an interesting situation here that occurred to me while Fred was talking and mentioning the amount of gold that's come over the top and the cattle that have driven over and the amount of money. And all while we've been talking, gold has been rolling by with a great thunderous roar in trucks.
That's right.
A different kind of gold, but nonetheless gold.
Well, anyway, they're still using the highway
still
here
using
to
the
a
highway.
great extent.
Well, the old road, of course, was below us here, below the rock.
It's the main thoroughfare.
And
Well, that's wonderful. Yeah, sure.
Well, we certainly appreciate your giving us all this information, Fred.
Well, you're very welcome.
We really appreciate it.